Picture this: a vast parchment, yellowed with age, its edges curling slightly, as if whispering secrets from centuries past. At first glance, it looks like a map with winding rivers and jagged coastlines. But look closer, and the world it depicts is nothing like our own. Here, in the uncharted corners, dragons coil around mountain ranges, sea serpents rear their heads from frothing waves, and distant islands are marked with warnings of giants or paradise. This isn't just a guide for travelers, it's a portal into the medieval imagination, where every stroke of ink reveals how people saw their world, not just as land and sea, but as a place where faith, fear, and wonder collided. These maps were more than tools, they were stories, pressed onto parchment by hands that believed the earth was as full of mysteries as it was of cities. So, what did these maps truly reveal about the medieval mind? Think about it: when you've never seen the edge of the ocean, when your world stretches only as far as the next village or the stories a merchant brings back from distant lands, how do you fill in the blanks? For medieval cartographers, the answer lay in the layers of their lives, the sermons they heard in church, the legends told by firelight, the lingering echoes of ancient texts. A blank space on the map wasn't empty, it was an invitation to populate it with the extraordinary. Monsters lurked where knowledge ended, not just to terrify, but to remind viewers that the world was vast, untamed, and charged with divine meaning. Even the shape of continents bent to the will of belief. Jerusalem at the center of the world, the Garden of Eden tucked just beyond the known, all of it woven together like a tapestry of faith and geography. That's the journey we're about to take together, unfolding these maps like the medieval minds that made them. We'll trace the lines between faith and fear, decode the symbols hidden in sea monsters and borderlands, and discover how these documents weren't just about where to go, but how to see. Because when you look closely, these maps aren't mistakes, they're masterpieces of a world, where every mountain could hide a miracle, and every ocean might spill off the edge of creation. By the end, you won't just see old parchment, you'll see the world as they did, vast, mysterious, and alive with possibility. Ready to step inside? Let's begin. To understand medieval maps, you have to forget everything you know about modern cartography. These weren't just directions for travelers, they were sermons in parchment, political manifestos, and even works of art. Imagine unrolling a map and seeing not just coastlines, but Adam and Eve standing in Eden, Christ presiding over the world from the heavens, or mythical beasts prowling the edges of the known. The Hereford Mappa Mundi, one of the most famous medieval maps, isn't a navigational tool, it's a visual Bible. Jerusalem sits at its heart, not because it was geographically central, but because it was spiritually supreme. The world radiated outward from that holy city like ripples in a pond, with every kingdom, river, and mountain arranged not by distance, but by divine hierarchy. This wasn't about getting from point A to point B. It was about understanding humanity's place in God's creation. The edges of these maps often dissolved into chaos. Dragons, dog-headed men, and other marvels lurked where knowledge ended. These weren't just flights of fancy, they were warnings. Beyond the familiar lay the unknown, a realm where faith and fear intertwined. Even the shape of continents bent to the will of belief. Africa might stretch into a land of scorching deserts ruled by mythical kings, while the far north could be a frozen wasteland haunted by giants. These weren't errors, they were choices, deliberate reflections of a world where the spiritual and physical were inseparable. And then there's the politics. A king might commission a map with his kingdom enlarged, his rivals diminished, or his lands blessed with heavenly favor. Maps were power wielded to justify conquests, sanctify borders, or even prove a ruler's divine right. The Psalter map, for example, doesn't just show Europe, it frames Christendom as the inheritor of the ancient world, with Rome and Jerusalem as twin pillars of sacred authority. Every line of ink carried weight, whispering to the viewer, this is not just how the world is, but how it should be. What's fascinating is how these maps reveal the tension between knowledge and imagination. Medieval scholars knew the earth was round. They'd read the ancient Greeks, but their maps often flattened it into a symbolic circle, with east at the top where paradise was said to lie. Why? Because truth wasn't just measured in miles, but in meaning. A winding river might twist unnaturally to pass by a saint's shrine, or an ocean might curl around the edge of the parchment like a protective embrace. These weren't mistakes, they were stories told in ink and vellum, where every detail was a thread in a grander tapestry of belief. So the next time you see a medieval map, don't look for accuracy, look for intention. Behind every sea monster and golden city is a mind trying to make sense of a vast, mysterious world, one where faith drew the borders and wonder filled in the gaps. These maps didn't just guide travelers, they guided souls, pointing not just to places but to purposes. And that's what makes them so extraordinary. They weren't charts of the earth as it was, but as it was dreamed to be. But the most captivating features of these maps weren't the cities or rivers, they were the creatures lurking at the edges. Here, where the parchment faded into the unknown, cartographers let their imaginations run wild. Dog-headed men gnashed their teeth in distant lands, scorpions with human faces guarded desert oases, and dragons coiled around mountains like living borders between the familiar and the forbidden. These weren't just decorations, they were warnings. Every monstrous figure whispered the same truth. Beyond here, the rules change. Take Sinos folly. The dog-headed men often sketched in the margins of maps. Medieval scholars debated whether these creatures had souls. Could they be baptized? Were they part of God's plan or something else entirely? Their presence on maps wasn't just about geography. It was about grappling with the limits of human understanding. And then there were the Blemii, tribes with faces in their chests, said to inhabit the scorching deserts of Africa. These beings weren't just myths, they were placeholders for the terrifying question, what else is out there that we don't know? Even the oceans teemed with peril. Sea serpents longer than ships twisted through uncharted waters, their jaws wide enough to swallow sailors whole. Some maps labeled these areas with phrases like, "Here be dragons," though that exact phrase is rarer than pop culture suggests. More often, the danger was implied: a ship tilted precariously near a whirlpool, or a tentacled beast rising from the waves. These weren't idle fantasies. They reflected real fears of storms, shipwrecks, and the vast, unknowable deep. But it wasn't all terror. Marvels glittered alongside the monsters. The edges of maps bloomed with islands of gold, forests where trees bore gemstones instead of fruit, and fountains whose waters granted eternal youth. These wonders drew from travelers' tales, like those of Marco Polo, who described rocks that burned coal and wool that grew on trees cotton. To medieval ears, these accounts blurred the line between fact and legend, and mapmakers eagerly wove them into their work. A single line on a parchment could spark dreams of adventure or nightmares of what might go wrong. What's striking is how these maps balanced fear and fascination. A dragon might guard a mountain pass, but just beyond it could lie a paradise of spices and silk. The unknown was both a threat and an invitation, a duality that shaped exploration for centuries. These creatures weren't mistakes, they were mirrors, reflecting the medieval mind's tangled mix of curiosity and caution. When you see a sea serpent on a map, you're not just looking at a monster, you're looking at the edge of the world as they knew it, where reality frayed into myth, and every blank space hummed with possibility. Jerusalem didn't sit at the center of medieval maps because it was geographically central. It sat there because it was spiritually indispensable. Picture a world where every road, both real and imagined, led back to this single point, not as a matter of distance but of devotion. The famous TO maps, shaped like a circle with a T inside, divided the known world into three parts: Europe, Asia, and Africa, each representing a branch of the Holy Trinity. At the intersection of those lines, where the crossbar met the stem, you'd find Jerusalem, a literal and symbolic axis mundi, the pivot around which the entire cosmos turned. This wasn't cartographic laziness, it was theology in ink. For medieval Christians, the physical world was a reflection of divine order, and Jerusalem's centrality echoed its role in Scripture, the site of Christ's crucifixion, the gateway to salvation, the place where heaven and earth touched. Maps like the Ebstorff Mappa Mundi took this further, depicting Christ himself embracing the world, his head, hands, and feet marking the edges of the parchment, as if to say the earth was literally held together by faith. Distortions weren't errors, they were affirmations. Rivers might bend unnaturally to flow toward Jerusalem, or distant lands might shrink in size to emphasize the holiness radiating from that sacred center. This worldview didn't just reshape geography, it redefined exploration. If Jerusalem was the heart of the world, then lands farther away were spiritually as well as physically distant. The edges of maps became moral frontiers where monsters and marvels thrived in equal measure. Africa's scorching deserts or Asia's endless steppes weren't just harsh landscapes, they were testing grounds for faith, places where the familiar rules of God's order seemed to fray. Even the peoples depicted in these margins, dog-headed men, giants, or tribes with no heads at all, were more than curiosities. They were challenges to medieval Europe's understanding of humanity's place in creation. Were these creatures part of God's plan, or were they warnings of what lay beyond the light of Christian truth? The TO map's simplicity hid a profound tension. On one hand, it offered comfort, a world neatly divided with Jerusalem as its beating heart. On the other, it hinted at unease, what lay beyond that tidy circle. The answer was often a blend of scripture and speculation. Some maps placed the Garden of Eden at the far eastern edge, a paradise lost but still present, while others marked the south with fiery wastelands straight out of apocalyptic visions. Every choice reinforced the idea that geography was never just about land, it was about destiny. So when medieval travelers set out for distant lands, they weren't just navigating by stars or landmarks, they were journeying through a landscape of belief. A mountain wasn't just a mountain, it might be the resting place of a saint's relics. A river wasn't just a river, it might trace the path of a biblical flood. These maps were guides to a world where every rock and tree hummed with hidden meaning, where reaching a physical destination meant stepping deeper into a divine story. And that's why Jerusalem's place at the center wasn't a mistake, it was the entire point. To move it would have been to unmake the world. The medieval world, as captured in those intricate TO maps, fit neatly into just three parts: Europe, Africa, and Asia, like slices of a pie cut by divine hand. This wasn't an oversight, it was the entire framework of their understanding. Beyond these continents lay only myth and speculation, realms unshaped by human knowledge. Europe, positioned at the top left, wasn't just a landmass, it was the self-proclaimed heart of Christendom, a place of order, piety, and in the eyes of its mapmakers, civilization. Rivers bent to frame its kingdoms, mountains stood like sentinels of faith, and every city bore the weight of divine favor. Yet this wasn't geography as we know it, it was geography as aspiration. Europe's prominence on the map wasn't earned by size or influence, but by the fervent belief that it was the chosen stage for God's plan. Africa, that vast and varied continent, rarely got the same treatment. On these maps, it shrank into a sliver of exotic danger, a land of scorching deserts and mythical kings. The Sahara wasn't just a barrier of sand, it was a moral frontier, separating the known from the other. Here, cartographers filled the blank spaces with gold-hoarding troglodytes, tribes whose faces grew on their chests, and rivers that boiled under the sun. These weren't neutral observations, they were warnings framing Africa as a place where nature itself defied God's order. Even the name Africa often vanished from maps, replaced by labels like Libya or Ethiopia, terms steeped in ancient Greek myths rather than the reality of thriving empires like Mali or Axum. The message was clear: this was a land to marvel at, perhaps to exploit, but never to truly know. And then there was Asia, the most enigmatic of the three. Stretching endlessly eastward, it was a canvas for every medieval fantasy. Somewhere beyond its borders lay the Garden of Eden, the kingdom of Prester John, and the lands of silk and spices that lured merchants into perilous journeys. Asia was paradoxically revered and feared, home to the wisdom of the Magi, yet also the lurking hordes of Gog and Magog, who'd burst forth during the apocalypse. Maps exaggerated its rivers into ribbons of paradise or twisted its mountains into the walls of Alexander, built to cage the monstrous tribes of the north. This wasn't ignorance, it was deliberate storytelling. Asia's mysteries justified crusades, inspired missions, and fueled the hunger for exploration that would later reshape the world. What's chilling is how these stereotypes didn't just decorate maps, they dictated destinies. When Europe's powers finally set sail beyond their tidy TO borders, they carried these biases like compasses. Africa became a source of slaves, not scholars. Asia a prize to plunder, not a peer to respect. The absence of the Americas or Australia on medieval maps wasn't just a gap in knowledge. It was a license to discover lands that, to their inhabitants, had never been lost. These maps didn't reflect the world, they scripted its conquest, turning imagination into empire with every stroke of the pen. So when you see those three continents, remember, you're not just looking at geography. You're looking at the birth certificate of the modern world, stamped with the prejudices of the past. At the far edges of medieval maps, beyond the dragons and dog-headed men, lay the most tantalizing destinations of all paradise and the kingdom of Prester John. These weren't just places, they were promises shimmering like mirages in the heat of human longing. The Garden of Eden, often tucked into the distant east, wasn't drawn as a lost relic but as a living, reachable sanctuary. Cartographers sketched its walls thick with fruit-laden trees, its rivers branching into the four corners of the earth, as if to say redemption wasn't just a memory, it was a destination. And then there was Prester John, the legendary Christian king, ruling a realm of untold wealth and virtue somewhere beyond the Islamic world. His kingdom pulsed on maps like a beacon, a divine ally waiting to rally against the enemies of Christendom. Together, these legends did more than decorate parchment. They fueled expeditions, funded voyages, and turned explorers into pilgrims chasing the horizon. Consider Christopher Columbus clutching a map heavy with these myths as he sailed westward. He didn't just seek a trade route, he was convinced he'd find Eden's foothills or the gates of Prester John's domain. His journals brim with references to biblical rivers and golden cities, proof that even the most practical navigators saw the world through the lens of medieval cartography. The line between faith and geography blurred until they were indistinguishable. When sailors reported strange plants or unfamiliar constellations, scholars pored over ancient texts to confirm they'd stumbled onto Eden's outskirts. Every unexplored coastline held the potential for divine revelation, or at least a sermon-worthy metaphor. Yet for all their spiritual fervor, medieval mapmakers faced a brutally practical problem. How do you chart a world you've never seen? Without satellites or accurate timekeeping, every coastline was a guess, every mountain range a rumor. Some relied on Ptolemy's ancient grids, warping them to fit biblical narratives. Others cobbled together accounts from merchants whose tales grew taller with each retelling. A river described as wide might balloon into a sea on parchment. A city mentioned in passing could sprawl into a metropolis of legend. The result was a patchwork of precision and fantasy, where a single scribe's quill could redraw the contours of continents. The irony is breathtaking. These maps, so steeped in celestial certainty, were grounded in earthly uncertainty. A cartographer might painstakingly measure the angle of a shadow to calculate latitude, then cheerfully sketch a griffon perched atop the nearest peak. They lived in a world where faith filled the gap science couldn't, where every blank space was an invitation to wonder. That tension between the divine and the tangible, the hoped for and the known, is what makes these maps so hauntingly human. They weren't just guides to the world, they were diaries of a civilization's dreams, inked in the trembling hand of someone who knew how much they'd never know. Medieval maps weren't just shaped by imagination, they were shackled by the limits of the tools and knowledge available at the time. Imagine trying to sketch an entire continent without ever leaving your monastery, relying on the accounts of travelers who might have exaggerated or misremembered every detail. There were no satellites, no precise instruments for measuring longitude, and no standardized way to record distances. Rivers might twist in impossible directions, coastlines could bulge or shrink based on a sailor's foggy recollection, and entire mountain ranges might vanish because no one had yet brought back word of them. This wasn't laziness, it was the reality of trying to chart a world that was still largely unknown. The irony is that the ancient Greeks had already solved many of these problems centuries earlier. Ptolemy, working in the 2nd century, had devised a system of coordinates and grids that could map the world with startling accuracy. His work laid the foundation for scientific cartography, but by the medieval period, much of that knowledge had been lost or ignored in Europe. When Ptolemy's texts were rediscovered during the Renaissance, scholars were stunned by their precision. Here were maps that treated geography as a science, not just a canvas for legends. But in the meantime, medieval cartographers had to make do with fragments of information, stitching together a patchwork of half-truths and hearsay. This lack of global perspective led to some startling distortions. Africa might appear as a narrow strip of land, simply because no European had ventured far enough south to realize its true scale. Asia could sprawl endlessly eastward, crammed with mythical kingdoms, while the Americas were absent entirely, not just uncharted but unimagined. Even the size of known regions was often wildly off. The Mediterranean Sea, a well-traveled waterway, might be drawn disproportionately large, simply because it was familiar, while the vastness of the Atlantic was reduced to a sliver. These weren't artistic choices, they were the best guesses of people working with incomplete puzzles. Yet these constraints also sparked creativity. When faced with blank spaces, mapmakers filled them with stories, dragons, saints, lost cities, turning gaps in knowledge into opportunities for wonder. A mountain range might become the home of a biblical giant. An uncharted ocean could hide islands of gold. These inventions weren't just fanciful, they reflected a worldview where the unknown was as much a spiritual frontier as a physical one. Without precise measurements, the line between fact and folklore blurred. and maps became living documents, evolving with every new tale from afar. What's fascinating is how these limitations reveal the priorities of the age. A modern map aims for objectivity, but a medieval map was unabashedly subjective, shaped by faith, fear, and the flickering light of available knowledge. The world wasn't just a place to navigate, it was a story to interpret, a divine manuscript where every blank space whispered of mysteries waiting to be uncovered. And that's why these maps, for all their inaccuracies, are so powerful. They don't just show us how little medieval people knew, they show us how much they dared to imagine. The stories that shaped medieval maps didn't come from precise measurements or satellite images. They spilled from the lips of sailors half-drunk on grog, pilgrims with blistered feet, and merchants spinning tales to justify the price of their silks. These weren't just travelers, they were unwitting cartographers, turning every anecdote into geography and every exaggeration into fact. Picture a weary merchant describing a distant land where roasted geese flew straight into people's mouths, where rivers ran with wine instead of water. That wasn't just a fireside joke, it was the birth of the land of Cockaigne, a utopia that appeared on maps as a real place, a shimmering mirage of abundance for societies haunted by famine and hardship. Cockaigne wasn't charted because it existed. It was charted because it had to exist, a fantasy so potent it demanded a spot on the parchment. This was the alchemy of medieval mapmaking. Rumor became rivers, legends became coastlines. When a pilgrim claimed to have seen a cliff where the souls of the damned howled in the wind, that cliff might appear on a map, labeled with grim certainty. A sailor's offhand mention of mermaids could populate an entire ocean with their sinuous forms. These weren't lies, they were reflections of a world where the line between observation and allegory was porous. Maps absorbed stories like sponges, and why wouldn't they? For people who'd never seen beyond their own valley, the word of a traveler was the closest thing to truth. But the most fascinating distortions weren't whimsical, they were strategic. Take the legendary island of Brassel, said to appear out of the mist off the coast of Ireland every 7 years. Its presence on maps wasn't just folklore, it was a siren call to adventurers, a lure to fund expeditions. The same went for the fabled Christian kingdom of Prester John, which migrated across maps of Africa and Asia like a mirage, always just out of reach, always promising salvation. These weren't mistakes, they were tools wielded by kings and popes to justify crusades, inspire colonization, or simply keep hope alive in a world where the unknown was terrifying. Yet as trade routes thickened and the world grew smaller, something surprising happened. Myths began to crumble under the weight of boots on the ground. Venetian merchants returning from the Silk Road could attest that no, the Caspian Sea didn't flow into the ocean, and no, the people of India didn't have faces in their chests. Slowly, grudgingly, maps started to change. The dragons retreated to the margins, the phantom islands faded, and the once mighty land of Cockaigne shrank into a footnote. Reality, it turned out, was stranger than fiction, just less comforting. What's remarkable is how long the stories clung to the parchment. Even as explorers like Marco Polo debunked old tales, their accounts were often dismissed as too mundane to be true. After all, who would trade a story about a land where pigs dug up truffles for one where pigs flew? The medieval mind craved wonder, and maps were the last place it was willing to surrender it. So next time you see an old map littered with monsters and marvels, remember, you're not just looking at geography, you're looking at the echoes of 1,000 voices, each one whispering, "What if?" For centuries, medieval maps had been shaped more by faith than fact, but then came the caravans. Picture the Silk Road not just as a path for silk and spices, but as a slow-moving river of knowledge, carrying whispers of distant lands back to Europe's scriptoriums. With every camel train that lumbered into Venice or Constantinople, merchants brought more than exotic goods. They carried fragments of the real world, stories of deserts wider than seas, mountains taller than heaven, and cities so vast they defied imagination. These weren't travelers' tall tales, they were corrections, chipping away at the dragons and dog-headed men that had crowded the edges of maps for generations. The Catalan Atlas, crafted in 1375, stands as a turning point in this quiet revolution. Here, for the first time, Africa wasn't just a stub of land cut off by fiery barriers. It curved southward, hinting at a continent far larger than Europe had dared to believe. The Sahara wasn't populated by blemi with faces on their chests, but by real trade routes snaking toward Timbuktu's gold markets. The Indian Ocean, once a swirling void of monsters, now bristled with the ports of Arabia and India, plotted with an accuracy borrowed from Arab navigators. This wasn't just a map, it was a mosaic of shared knowledge, pieced together from Jewish, Muslim, and Christian sources. The Catalan Atlas didn't erase myths entirely. Prester John still lurked in Ethiopia, and paradise still gleamed in the east. But it marked the moment when commerce began to outpace legend in the race to chart the world. Yet old beliefs died hard, even as Marco Polo's accounts of paper money and burning black stones coals circulated. Scholars debated whether to trust a man who claimed to have seen unicorns which, in hindsight, were likely rhinos. Maps became battlegrounds between the seen and the imagined. A merchant might swear the Caspian Sea was landlocked, only for a monk to insist it flowed into the ocean, as ancient texts proclaimed. The tension was palpable. Should a cartographer honor the sailor who'd actually sailed the coast, or the saint who'd supposedly walked on its waters? What's striking is how grudgingly accuracy advanced. Trade routes didn't just bring facts, they forced a reckoning with the limits of medieval Europe's worldview. When Arab geographers like Al-Idrisi described a round earth divided into climactic zones, their works were translated, then quietly ignored where they clashed with scripture. The earth might be a sphere to astronomers, but to mapmakers it often remained a disk, with Jerusalem at its heart and edges that dissolved into divine mystery. And so, the march toward precision was less a sprint than a stumble. Portolan's navigational charts for sailors could trace coastlines with astonishing detail, while the world maps hanging in palaces still sprouted griffins and giants. Knowledge flowed in like a tide, but the shorelines of belief shifted slowly. Every merchant's ledger, every sailor's log, was a brick in the slow construction of a new world picture. One where the unknown wasn't filled with monsters, but with markets. The dragons didn't vanish, they just retreated, waiting in the margins for the next era of explorers to confront them all over again. The rediscovery of Ptolemy's ancient texts in the early 15th century hit medieval Europe like a thunderclap. Here, buried in forgotten manuscripts, was a vision of the world that didn't revolve around Jerusalem or teem with biblical symbolism, but instead laid out a grid of latitude and longitude, treating geography as a science rather than a sermon. Scholars pored over his coordinates, stunned by their precision. Suddenly, the TO maps with their 3 neat continents seemed childish, their monsters and marvels embarrassingly out of place. But embracing Ptolemy meant more than updating coastlines. It meant dismantling a worldview where faith had drawn the borders. The Church had spent centuries teaching that the earth was a stage for divine drama, its shape and center ordained by Scripture. Now, here was a pagan astronomer from the 2nd century suggesting the world was bigger, stranger, and far less centered on holy cities than anyone had dared to admit. Fra Mauri's map, crafted around 1450, captures this clash beautifully. A Venetian monk working in a twilight between eras, he dared to tilt the world upside down, placing south at the top. a nod to Arab cartographers who'd long since moved beyond European parochialism. Even more radical, he shoved Jerusalem slightly off-center, admitting what traders had known for centuries. The holy city wasn't the navel of the earth, just one node in a vast web of commerce and cultures. His map still sprinkled marvels at the edges: pygmies battling cranes in Ethiopia, the fabled tomb of Adam in Ceylon, but its framework was revolutionary. Rivers flowed where they actually ran, not where theologians wished them to. Africa stretched southward, defying the old belief that the equator was a boiling wasteland where no life could survive. Fra Mauro didn't erase the medieval imagination. He forced it to share space with something new: evidence. The backlash was inevitable. Traditionalists clung to the Hereford mappa Mundi's certainty, where every hillock and harbor hummed with divine purpose. How could a grid of numbers compete with a map where Christ himself embraced the edges of creation? But the genie was out of the bottle. Sailors returning from Africa's coasts brought tales that matched Ptolemy's coordinates, not the old myths. Merchants crisscrossing the Indian Ocean reported no dragons, just monsoons and markets. The very tools that had once been used to glorify God, compasses, astrolabes, now whispered heresies. The earth was vaster, more complex, and less obedient to medieval Europe's sense of centrality than anyone had dreamed. Then came the hammer blow, the age of exploration. When Dyers rounded the Cape of Good Hope in 1488, he didn't just find a new trade route. He shattered the idea that Africa was an impassable barrier ordained by God. Columbus, though he clung to his biblical calculations, accidentally proved the ocean wasn't an endless abyss of monsters. With every voyage, the old maps frayed a little more, their edges dissolving not into divine mystery, but into terra incognita waiting to be measured, claimed, and commodified. The dragons didn't vanish, they were simply outflanked by caravels and compasses. By the time Magellan's crew circumnavigated the globe, the medieval map wasn't just outdated, it was obsolete, a relic of a world that had never really existed outside the pages of psalters and pilgrim guides. What's haunting is how fiercely that old world resisted. Long after the new geography took root, maps still hid Eden in some uncharted corner or sketched Prester John's kingdom in fading ink. The human mind, it seems, needs its mysteries as much as its facts, but the shift was irreversible. Ptolemy's grids had unlocked a terrifying truth. The earth wasn't a storybook written by God, but a puzzle to be solved by human hands. And once that puzzle began to take shape, there was no room left for dragons at the edges, only empires waiting to be drawn. In the scriptoriums of medieval monasteries, where the air smelled of ink and candle wax, maps weren't just drawn, they were sanctified. The church didn't merely influence cartography, it held the quill. Every coastline, every city, every monstrous margin was scrutinized for doctrinal compliance, because a map wasn't a neutral object, it was a testament to God's design. Monks bent over parchments for months, copying ancient texts and embellishing them with biblical scenes, ensuring the world they depicted matched the one described in Scripture. Jerusalem had to sit at the center. The Garden of Eden must appear in the east, and any suggestion that the earth might be older than the Bible claimed, or that lands beyond Christendom held equal worth, was quietly scraped from the vellum like heresy waiting to happen. Consider the fate of the Norse sagas, which told of Leif Eriksson's voyages to Vinland, what we now call North America. These stories circulated in the north for centuries, yet they vanished from official maps. Why? Because the church had no interest in a world that predated its own narrative of discovery. A land reached by pagan sailors, outside the framework of Christian conquest, was a threat. So Vinland became a ghost, whispered in taverns but absent from parchment, until archaeology dragged it back into the light centuries later. This wasn't ignorance, it was censorship. The church's maps weren't lies, exactly they were corrections, aligning the chaotic reality of exploration with the tidy certainty of faith. Monasteries became factories of holy geography. Take the work of Bede, an 8th century monk who calculated the Earth's shape using biblical clues rather than Greek mathematics. His writings, copied and recopied, became the bedrock of medieval cartography. In places like St. Gall or Monte Cassino, monks blended Ptolemy's grids with scenes from Revelation, turning maps into illuminated manuscripts where rivers flowed with spiritual significance. A mountain might be labeled not just by its location, but by the saint who'd prayed there. The Hereford mappa Mundi, crammed with over 500 biblical vignettes, wasn't meant to guide travelers, it was meant to convert them, imprinting a Christian worldview onto the very landscape. Yet cracks in this control began to show. As trade routes expanded, merchants returned with accounts that didn't fit the church's tidy schema. Arab navigators spoke of a round earth long before Europeans admitted it. Jewish scholars, often working in secret, preserved star charts that contradicted ecclesiastical dogma. Even within monastery walls, some monks quietly questioned why God would place dragons on the edges of creation. The tension was palpable: cling to the old sanctified maps or risk the terrifying freedom of a world not yet fully claimed by Scripture. By the late Middle Ages, that tension erupted into open challenge. Princes and pirates alike demanded accurate charts for their voyages, not Sunday school lessons in parchment form. The church's monopoly on truth was slipping, its once unquestioned maps now fraying at the edges, not from dragons' teeth, but from the nibs of secular cartographers who cared more for profit than paradise. And so, as the age of exploration dawned, the world began to shrug off its holy borders, revealing a geography far stranger and far more wondrous than the church had ever allowed. While monks labored over sacred maps in candlelit scriptoriums, a quiet revolution was unfolding in the harbors of Europe, one where faith took a backseat to the brutal pragmatism of the sea. Portolan charts, the navigational lifelines of sailors, bore no angels, no Eden, no Jerusalem at their heart. Instead, they bristled with jagged coastlines, crisscrossed by lines radiating like spiderwebs, the room lines that guided ships through treacherous waters. These weren't maps for contemplating God's design. They were tools for survival, drawn by hands that knew the sting of salt spray and the terror of a fog-shrouded reef. The contrast couldn't have been starker. Where the Hereford mappa Mundi sprawled with biblical tableaus, a portolan chart from the same era might focus solely on the Mediterranean, its shores etched with such precision that modern cartographers still marvel at their accuracy. Wind patterns were marked with meticulous care, harbors annotated with depth soundings, and hazards like sandbanks drawn in ominous detail. This wasn't guesswork, it was hard-won knowledge, passed from pilot to pilot in a language of practicality, not prophecy. The portolan's power lay in its limitations. It didn't pretend to map the cosmos, only the coastline a ship could realistically navigate before supplies ran out. What's striking is how these charts emerged from the margins of society. While scholars debated the location of paradise in university halls, illiterate sailors were stitching together a new geography from lived experience. A Genos captain might trade a barrel of wine for a rival's notes on a hidden cove in Crete, then add it to his own chart with a steady hand. Over generations, these fragments coalesced into documents so valuable they were often locked in chests alongside gold. Unlike the church's maps, which declared absolute truths, portolans were fluid, updated with each voyage, corrected by each shipwreck, their edges frayed from constant use. This shift toward empiricism didn't just change navigation, it rewrote the rules of power. Kings and merchants quickly grasped that whoever controlled the best charts controlled the trade routes. The infamous Medici family didn't just bankroll artists. They hoarded portolans like state secrets, understanding that a single accurate map of the African coast could mean the difference between a fortune in spices and a fleet lost to the doldrums. Even the church, despite its grip on sacred geography, couldn't ignore the utility of these secular tools. By the 15th century, Vatican librarians were quietly acquiring portolans, their once unshakable certainty bending to the demands of a world where gold flowed faster than grace. And so the stage was set for a collision. On one side, the old order where maps were mirrors of divine will. On the other, a new world of compass bearings and profit margins, where the only miracle that mattered was making port alive. The dragons hadn't vanished, they'd just been outmaneuvered by men who trusted the stars more than scripture, and whose charts whispered a dangerous truth. The earth wasn't a parable to be read, but a puzzle to be mastered. When kings and popes unrolled maps in their chambers, they weren't just admiring the artwork, they were drawing battle lines. A medieval map was less a reflection of the world than a blueprint for power. Its borders inked with the confidence of men who believed land could be claimed by parchment as surely as by the sword. Take the Borgia map, a stunning 15th century masterpiece dripping with gold leaf. At first glance, it's a marvel of artistry, its continents swirling like living things. But look closer and you'll spot the political fingerprints. Rome isn't just a dot on the landscape, it's the radiant heart of Christendom, its influence stretching across the Mediterranean like divine writ. This wasn't geography, it was propaganda, a visual sermon declaring the Pope's right to rule not just souls but soil. The calculus was simple. If you could put it on a map, you could justify taking it. When European powers eyed the coast of Africa or the islands of the Atlantic, their first step wasn't always an armada, it was a cartographer. The Portuguese, masters of this game, sent mapmakers ahead of their ships, carefully sketching West Africa's shores not as they were, but as Portugal wished them to be, open, divisible, ripe for conquest. Blank spaces became invitations. Native cities were renamed or erased entirely, replaced with Latin labels and crosses to sanctify the theft. A well-placed mountain range on parchment could justify a territorial claim, while a strategically omitted rival's fortress might make a kingdom seem undefended. Maps didn't just describe empires, they designed them, but the true genius of these documents lay in their ambiguity. A map could be a sword and a shield. The same Borgia map that exalted papal power also left certain borders deliberately fuzzy, allowing Rome to later clarify them in its favor. When King Alfonso V of Aragon wanted to press his claim to Naples, he didn't just send soldiers. He commissioned a map showing Naples nestled snugly within his realm, as if God himself had drawn the lines. And when the Treaty of Tordesillas split the New World between Spain and Portugal in 1494, the dividing line wasn't drawn on the earth, but on a map so imprecise that both sides could spend decades arguing and expanding based on their own interpretations. This cartographic chess game reached its peak with colonialism. As Europe's ships groped their way across the globe, maps became the ultimate trophy cases. Every new coastline charted was a possession declared. Every native village renamed was a culture overwritten. The Cantino planisphere, smuggled out of Portugal in 1502, didn't just show Brazil, it stamped the Portuguese flag onto the land like a wax seal on a deed. Indigenous territories vanished beneath European place names, their rivers straightened, their mountains tamed into familiar shapes. The message was clear. This land wasn't discovered, it was invented, reshaped by the pens of men who'd never set foot there. Yet the most insidious power of these maps wasn't in their lies, but in their half-truths. By blending real geography with imperial fantasy, they created a reality that even the conquered began to accept. When a Bengali fisherman saw a British map labeling his ancestral fishing grounds as Crown property, the parchment didn't just assert control, it rewrote history. Generations later, descendants might point to that same map as proof of legitimate ownership, forgetting it was ever anything else. Maps, in the end, were the ultimate conquerors. Their borders outlasted armies, their names outlived memory, and their versions of the world became so ingrained that we still navigate by their ghosts. What's chilling is how these medieval tactics never really faded, they just evolved. The same tricks used to justify crusades and colonies now shape satellite images and digital borders. When we zoom in on a disputed region on our phones, whose names do we see, whose boundaries are highlighted, and whose are dashed lines waiting to be made solid? The Borgia map's legacy isn't locked in parchment, it's alive in every pixel that insists the world belongs to those bold enough to draw it first. On the Hereford mappa Mundi, a man with his face embedded in his chest stares blankly from the scorching deserts of Africa, while nearby, a pair of legs sprout grotesquely from his shoulders. This wasn't artistic whimsy, it was deliberate othering, a visual shorthand that whispered to medieval Europeans, "They are not like us." Maps didn't just chart geography, they codified prejudice, transforming distant peoples into walking symbols of sin, savagery, or divine mockery. The Blemii, Cyapods, and Cynosphale tribes with faces in their torsos, single giant feet, or dog heads weren't just folklore. They were political tools sketched onto parchment to justify everything from crusades to colonial conquests by framing foreign lands as realms of chaos waiting for Christian order. The Hereford mappa Mundi is particularly revealing. Africa and Asia aren't merely places, they're carnival mirrors, distorting real cultures into monstrous spectacles. The Nile winds past pygmies battling cranes, while the land of the monoculi teems with one-eyed giants caricatures that reduced entire civilizations to freak show attractions. These weren't neutral observations, they were warnings. By portraying non-Europeans as literal aberrations, mapmakers reinforced a binary worldview. Here, civilization. There, chaos. The message was clear. These lands weren't just unknown, they were unworthy of autonomy, ripe for salvation through conquest or conversion. But the most insidious power of these images lay in their ambiguity. A cyapod shading himself with his single foot might seem laughable, but his presence subtly framed entire continents as fundamentally inferior. When medieval scholars debated whether dog-headed men could be baptized, they weren't pondering theology, they were wrestling with the dehumanization required to exploit distant peoples. These maps didn't just reflect bias, they weaponized it, turning cultural difference into a moral failing that demanded intervention. By the time European ships reached Africa's shores, the groundwork had been laid. The people they encountered weren't neighbors, but puzzles to be solved or obstacles to be removed. Yet not all maps toe this line. The Catalan Atlas, created by Jewish cartographer Abraham Cresques in 1375, strikes a different tone. Here, Mali's ruler Mansa Musa sits enthroned in gold, a nod to his legendary pilgrimage to Mecca that flooded Cairo with wealth. The Atlas's Africa brims with trading cities, not monsters, a rare acknowledgement of thriving societies beyond Europe's borders. Even rarer is the Kangnido map from Korea, which centers Asia and depicts Europeans as the distant curiosities, their features exaggerated for comic effect. These outliers prove the stereotypes weren't inevitable, they were choices shaped by who held the pen and who stood to profit from the narrative. What's haunting is how these medieval tropes outlived the parchment. When colonial powers drew borders across Africa and Asia, they weren't just dividing land, they were imposing a vision forged centuries earlier on the Hereford mappa Mundi. one where civilized rulers had a divine right to reshape savage spaces. The monsters faded from maps, but the mindset remained. The world was still split between us and them, with the same old justifications draped in new jargon. Today, when we scroll past clickbait headlines reducing foreign cultures to exotic oddities, we're seeing the ghost of those dog-headed men, still whispering from the edges of our collective imagination. While European monks sketched Jerusalem at the center of their sacred TO maps halfway across the world, a different kind of cartography was flourishing, one where science, not scripture, drew the borders. In the bustling libraries of Islamic Cordoba and the imperial courts of Song Dynasty China, scholars were crafting maps so precise they'd make a medieval European cleric gasp. Take the extraordinary work of Al-Idrisi, a 12th century geographer commissioned by Sicily's Norman king to synthesize knowledge from Arab traders, Jewish merchants, and Byzantine explorers. His tabula Rogeriana wasn't cluttered with dog-headed men or biblical scenes. It was a sprawling, meticulous panorama of the known world, from the snow-capped peaks of the Caucasus to the monsoon-swept ports of Malabar. Unlike European maps that bent continents to fit theology, Al-Idrisi's work was anchored in eyewitness accounts and mathematical grids, with coastlines rendered so accurately they'd remain reference points for centuries. China's cartographers were even more radical. While Europe still debated whether the Earth was flat, Chinese scholars like Pei Ziyu in the 3rd century had already developed grid-based mapping systems using scaled measurements. The Yujai Tu, carved into stone in 1137, depicts China with a precision that wouldn't reach Europe until the Renaissance, complete with mountain ranges, rivers, and over 4,000 place names plotted using a grid of 100 Lie squares. These weren't symbolic gestures, they were administrative tools designed to govern an empire with ruthless efficiency. When the Mongol Yuan dynasty commissioned maps in the 13th century, they prioritized trade routes and postal stations over mythical kingdoms, creating documents that felt shockingly modern in their pragmatism. The irony is that Europe knew about these advances but often dismissed them. Arab texts like Al-Idrisi's were translated in places like Toledo's famed translation schools, yet their scientific rigor was filtered through layers of Christian bias. A monk might copy Al-Idrisi's coordinates but omit his rejection of biblical literalism, or retain his map of Sicily while scrubbing away his notes on Islamic scholarship. Chinese maps, when they trickled westward via Silk Road merchants, were treated as curiosities rather than breakthroughs. Marco Polo's accounts of Chinese paper money and coal were met with laughter, so why trust their outlandish claim that the Earth's surface could be measured in squares? This cultural myopia had consequences. While European maps obsessed over Eden and Judgment Day, Islamic and Chinese cartographers were charting the cyclical monsoons of the Indian Ocean, or calculating the curvature of the Earth with astrolabes. The Kitab al-Mazalik wal Mamalik, Book of Roads and Kingdoms by 9th century geographer Ibn Khordad Bey, didn't just list trade routes, it documented customs duties, local currencies, and even the quality of inns along the way. Meanwhile, Korea's Kangnido map of 1402 stretched from Arabia to Japan, its vast scope reflecting a worldview where no single culture claimed centrality. What's tragic is how much was lost in the transmission. When European explorers finally set sail in the 15th century, they did so with maps half blind to the world beyond Christendom. Imagine how history might have changed if Vasco da Gama had studied Zheng He's nautical charts of the Indian Ocean, or if Columbus had consulted the Tabula Rogeriana instead of mistaking the Caribbean for the Indies. The legacy of these overlooked traditions isn't just a footnote, it's a reminder that maps have always been battlegrounds of ideology, where the lines we draw reveal far more about ourselves than the lands they claim to depict. The dragons may have vanished from our atlases, but their shadows still stretch across modern maps, not in ink but in imagination. Open any fantasy novel, from Tolkien's Middle-earth to the sprawling realms of Game of Thrones, and you'll find coastlines dotted with cryptic runes, borders crawling with stylized beasts, and vast swaths labeled "Here be unknown." These aren't just aesthetic choices, they're direct heirs to the medieval tradition where maps were as much about wonder as they were about wayfinding. Tolkien, a scholar of Old English, deliberately borrowed the look of the Hereford mappa Mundi for his fictional landscapes, filling Middle-earth with forests that whispered of eldritch danger and mountains that loomed like moral barriers. Even the blank spaces on his maps, the Wilderland, the shadowy sea, echo the medieval habit of letting mystery thrive where knowledge ended. Fantasy cartography, it turns out, isn't an escape from reality. It's a revival of how we once saw reality. But the legacy runs deeper than fiction. Think of how we still talk about uncharted territory when facing the unknown, a phrase that once described literal blank parchment, now applied to everything from AI ethics to deep space exploration. Medieval maps thrived on the tension between the known and the imagined, and so do we. Modern infographics about the ocean floor or the human brain often borrow the same visual language, shading unexplored regions with artistic conjecture or placeholder icons. The mare incognitum of old has become the dark matter of astrophysics or the uncharted neural pathways of neuroscience, still framed as frontiers, still sparking that same mix of fear and fascination. Even geopolitical metaphors lean on medieval tropes. When politicians warn of failed states as lawless voids or describe rival nations as black boxes, they're resurrecting the old idea that beyond civilization lies chaos. Perhaps most telling is how stubbornly we cling to the idea of centers. Just as medieval cartographers placed Jerusalem at the heart of their world, modern maps subtly reinforce our own biases, whether it's the Greenwich meridian defining global time or the Eurocentric projections that inflate the size of northern continents. The digital age hasn't erased these habits, it's digitized them. Zoom in on Google Earth, and you'll still find algorithms that prioritize certain landmarks over others, or borders that flicker with the ghosts of old disputes. The lines we draw today, whether on screens or in space treaties, carry the same weight they did when kings pressed seals onto vellum, less about accuracy, more about authority. Yet there's beauty in this continuity. Those old mapmakers, for all their monsters and myths, understood something we're only now relearning, that a map is never just a tool. It's a story. When NASA labels Martian craters after mythical cities or SpaceX names its rockets after sci-fi vessels, they're following the same impulse that once sketched paradise beyond the Indus. The medium has changed from parchment to pixels, but the human urge remains to chart not just where we are, but where we long to go. Medieval maps remind us that every exploration begins with a dream, scribbled at the edges of what we dare to know. Unfurl a medieval map, and the first thing that strikes you isn't the geography, it's the explosion of color, gold leaf catching the light like a stained glass window, intricate borders teeming with scenes of daily life and divine intervention. These weren't just functional documents, they were masterpieces of illumination where every inch of parchment hummed with artistry. Take the Ebstorf map, a colossal 13th century creation so vivid it could double as an altarpiece. Christ's body frames the known world, his hands and feet marking the cardinal directions, while within those sacred boundaries, cities rise like jeweled pins and rivers coil like ribbons. The map didn't just show the earth, it sanctified it, turning geography into an act of worship. Monks spent years painting these details, grinding lapis lazuli for celestial blues, mixing crushed malachite for emerald forests, and burnishing gold to halo holy sites. This was cartography as sacrament, where beauty was as essential as accuracy. Compare that to the sterile grids of Google Maps today. Modern navigation tools prioritize efficiency, clean lines, minimalist icons, algorithmic precision, but something profound has been lost in the transition. Digital maps lack the tactile richness of vellum under fingertips, the scent of iron gall ink, the way a medieval mapmaker might pause to sketch a ship in the margin mid-voyage, or gild a saint's shrine with reverence. The Ebstorff map's illustrations weren't embellishments, they were the point. A traveler tracing its routes didn't just see a path from Paris to Rome. They passed shepherds tending flocks, knights jousting in castle yards, and angels hovering at the edges, reminders that every journey was woven into a grander divine narrative. The calligraphy alone was a marvel. Gothic script curled like vine tendrils around place names, each letter painstakingly formed with a quill sharpened to a hair's breadth. Towns weren't labeled, they were announced, their names arched triumphantly over painted towers. Even the mistakes were artful. A monk might misplace a mountain range but compensate with a breathtakingly detailed dragon coiled around the era, turning a flaw into folklore. This wasn't carelessness, it was a different philosophy of truth. Where we demand precision, they sought meaning, believing a map should uplift the soul as much as guide the body. Yet the artistry served a deeper purpose. In an age when few could read, these maps were visual sermons. The Hereford Mapar, Mundi's depiction of hell, all gnashing teeth and writhing sinners, wasn't just decorative, it was a warning to pilgrims. The golden towers of Jerusalem, shining brighter than any real city, weren't exaggeration, they were aspiration. Every brushstroke whispered, "This world is fleeting, but its divine order is eternal." Modern maps show us where to go, medieval maps told us why. And then there were the materials themselves, parchment scraped from calfskin so fine it glowed when held to light. Inks brewed from oak galls and iron salts that darkened with age like wine. These weren't cheap commodities, they were luxuries funded by bishops and kings who understood the power of a map that dazzled as much as it directed. The craftsmanship was a form of devotion, a belief that representing God's creation deserved the same care as crafting a cathedral window. Today, we tap screens and summon satellite views in seconds, but the trade-off is palpable. Convenience has cost us wonder. What's haunting is how fragile this artistry proved. The Ebstorff map was destroyed in World War II, surviving only in copies. Fires, wars, and time have erased countless others, leaving us with fragments of a world where geography and glory were inseparable. Yet in those surviving strokes of color and gold, we catch glimpses of a time when maps weren't tools, they were treasures, held as reverently as relics, their beauty a testament to the sacredness of the world they sought to capture. Creating a medieval map was an act of devotion, patience, and sheer physical endurance. Picture a monk hunched over a stretched calfskin, his hands stained with ink as he painstakingly traced coastlines with a quill sharpened to a needle's point. Vellum, the premium material of choice, wasn't just paper, it was a labor-intensive canvas. Skins were soaked in lime, scraped of hair and flesh, then stretched on frames to dry into smooth, creamy sheets. A single large map might require the hides of dozens of calves, each one costing more than a peasant's monthly wages. Mistakes weren't just frustrating, they were catastrophic. A misplaced stroke or smudged pigment meant days of work and precious materials scraped away with a knife, or worse, the entire sheet discarded. This wasn't artistry, it was alchemy, transforming animal skin into a window onto the world. The pigments themselves were treasures ground from minerals and plants across continents. Ultramarine blue, the color of the Virgin Mary's robes, came from lapis lazuli mined in Afghanistan and carried thousands of miles by caravan. Reds were culled from crushed insects or rare mercury sulfide, greens from malachite or verdigris. Gold leaf, applied with a brush dampened by the artist's breath, shimmered like celestial light across holy cities. Each hue carried meaning: red for martyrdom, gold for divinity, green for earthly life. Mixing them required not just skill but ritual. Some recipes called for egg yolk as a binder, others for gum arabic with proportions guarded like state secrets. The palette wasn't just decorative, it was doctrinal, reinforcing hierarchies of sacred and profane with every stroke. Behind these masterpieces stood guilds, the medieval equivalent of intellectual startups. In cities like Florence or Bruges, cartographers' workshops buzzed with apprentices grinding pigments, masters drafting coastlines, and merchants bartering for the latest charts. Knowledge passed in whispers: how to mimic Arab star charts without admitting their source, or the trick of pricking tiny holes along a room line to transfer it to new parchment. Apprentices spent years mastering the hand of their guild, the distinctive script that made their work recognizable. A single map might pass through a dozen hands, a scholar drafting the outline, a painter filling continents, a scribe labeling cities in meticulous blackletter. This wasn't solitary genius, it was a symphony of specialized labor, each contributor anonymous but essential. Yet for all their care, these maps were doomed to fade. Sunlight bleached vermilion to pink, humidity curled vellum into brittle scrolls, and fire, the eternal enemy of parchment, turned centuries of work to ash in moments. The few survivors, like the Hereford mappa Mundi or the Catalan atlas, are miracles of chance, spared by damp cathedral vaults or the indifference of librarians who tuck them away as curiosities. Today, we study them under LED lights and humidity controls, their once vibrant pigments now ghostly, their gold dimmed. But in their scars, the knife marks where a monk corrected a coastline, the faint fingerprints in a margin. We touch not just geography, but the hands that believed the world could be held in ink and faith. Among the handful of medieval maps that survived the ravages of time, few are as breathtaking or as enigmatic as the Hereford mappa Mundi. Stretching over 5 feet tall, this 13th century masterpiece isn't just a map, it's a sprawling visual encyclopedia of the medieval mind. Jerusalem glows at its center like a jewel, while the edges dissolve into a menagerie of marvels: dragons, unicorns, and tribes of headless men with faces on their chests. Created around 1290 by an obscure scribe named Richard of Holdingham, the map was likely commissioned for Hereford Cathedral, where it served as both a teaching tool and a sacred object. For centuries, it hung in obscurity, nearly discarded during the English Civil War before being rediscovered in the cathedral's archives. Its vellum cracked, but its colors still whispering of a world where faith and geography were inseparable. Today, it survives under bulletproof glass, a fragile testament to an era when maps were more theology than topography. Then there's the Catalan atlas, a radiant departure from Europe's faith-steeped traditions. Crafted in 1375 by the Jewish cartographer Abraham Cresques, this map was commissioned by the King of Aragon as a gift to the French crown, a diplomatic masterpiece dripping with gold leaf and precision. Unlike the Hereford mappa Mundi's biblical focus, the Catalan atlas is a celebration of trade and technology, its 6 panels stretching from the Atlantic to China. It's the first European map to depict the Sahara's gold routes accurately, and it paints Mali's Emperor Mansa Musa seated on a golden throne, holding a nugget the size of his fist. The atlas didn't just map the world, It mapped power, weaving together Jewish, Arab, and Christian knowledge into a document so valuable it was kept under lock and key. After vanishing for centuries, it resurfaced in the 1930s, hidden in a French library's basement, its once vibrant blues and reds still luminous enough to hint at its original splendor. But no medieval map sparks fiercer debate than the Vinland map, discovered in 1957 and purportedly dating to the 1400s. It shows a shadowy landmass west of Greenland labeled Vinland, a name from Norse sagas describing Leif Erikson's voyages to North America centuries before Columbus. If genuine, it would rewrite history as the first known European depiction of the New World. Yet from the moment it surfaced, skeptics pounced. The ink seemed suspiciously modern. The wormholes in the parchment didn't align with its supposed companion manuscript, and chemical analyses revealed traces of 20th century compounds. Defenders argued the anomalies could stem from restoration attempts, but the controversy rages on. The Vinland map is either one of cartography's greatest finds or its most elaborate hoax, a puzzle that even carbon dating and spectral imaging haven't fully solved. What unites these maps isn't just their age, but their resilience. The Hereford mappa Mundi survived Reformation iconoclasm. The Catalan atlas outlasted the persecution of its Jewish creator, and the Vinland map, real or fake, endures as a magnet for obsession. Each one carries scars, faded pigments, knife marks from corrections, the ghostly imprints of hands that held them centuries ago. They've been smuggled, forged over, and nearly destroyed, yet they cling to existence, offering fractured glimpses into how our ancestors saw their world. And now, with tools their makers couldn't have dreamed of, we're learning to read them all over again, not just for their geography, but for the secrets hidden in their very fibers. Multispectral imaging has cracked open a treasure chest of secrets hidden in medieval maps, revealing layers of ink and parchment that the naked eye could never detect. By scanning these ancient documents with ultraviolet and infrared light, researchers uncover erased texts, ghostly sketches, and even entire regions that were scraped away or painted over. Take the famous Hereford mappa Mundi under multispectral analysis. Faint lines emerge showing earlier drafts where coastlines were redrawn or biblical scenes repositioned. These aren't just corrections, they're whispers of the mapmaker's second thoughts, moments where theology and geography wrestled on the parchment. One stunning discovery. A lost city labeled beneath the vellum, its name scratched out so thoroughly that only spectral imaging could resurrect it. Suddenly, a map isn't just a snapshot of belief, it's a living document, its edits chronicling shifts in power, faith, or simply better information trickling in from a returning merchant. Digital reconstructions take this further, letting us step inside these maps as if they were worlds to explore. Projects like the virtual mappa don't just digitize medieval cartography, they animate it. Click on a dragon at the edge of a 14th century map, and a pop-up unpacks its origins. Is it a warning to sailors, a metaphor for sin? Zoom into Jerusalem's golden towers, and layers peel back to show how different scribes embellished them over time. These tools transform static artifacts into interactive classrooms, where every ink blot becomes a doorway. The British Library's Turning the Pages project even simulates the tactile experience of handling vellum, complete with the sound of parchment rustling, a small detail that bridges 7 centuries in an instant. The real revolution lies in how these technologies are rewriting history itself. When scholars superimpose medieval maps onto modern geographic software, patterns emerge that textbooks missed. A river's unnatural bend on a TO map might align perfectly with a pilgrimage route, revealing that the distortion wasn't ignorance, it was emphasis. Digital overlays of trade routes expose how merchants' paths influenced the size of cities on parchment, proving that economics shaped these maps as much as religion. Even erasures tell stories. Multispectral imaging of the Catalan atlas showed traces of a vanished island, later identified as a fabrication by a sailor angling for royal funding. Suddenly, we're not just studying maps, we're decoding the human motives behind them. What's next? Artificial intelligence now combs through thousands of map features, spotting connections no single scholar could. Algorithms analyze ink composition to trace pigments back to specific mines, revealing trade networks. Handwriting recognition software identifies anonymous scribes by their quirks, a flourish on a capital J, a preference for green over blue, unmasking the collaborative workshops behind single-author masterpieces. These tools don't just preserve the past, they propel it forward, turning medieval maps into living labs where history, technology, and detective work collide. The dragons may still lurk at the edges, but we're finally learning their true names. Calling medieval maps wrong misses the point entirely, like criticizing a cookbook for not being a chemistry textbook. These weren't attempts at scientific accuracy. They were visual sermons, political manifestos, and cultural mirrors rolled into one. Consider the Hereford Mapar, Mundi's sprawling biblical scenes alongside its coastlines. No one at the time would have used it to navigate from London to Rome, just as you wouldn't use a subway map to plot global flight paths. The distortion was the point. Rivers bent toward holy sites, not because cartographers failed geometry, but because spiritual significance outweighed physical distance. Jerusalem's central placement wasn't a miscalculation, it was a declaration. This is the heart of the world's story, not its geography. Modern infographics follow the same rules. A climate change map might exaggerate polar ice loss with stark red hues, not to falsify data, but to sear urgency into viewers' minds. Corporate logos distort continents to emphasize market reach over land. As Africa shrinks while North America bloats, echoing medieval priorities with corporate branding. Even GPS apps prioritize clarity over reality. Your blue dot glides smoothly around cartoonish streets, ignoring the potholes and construction zones of the actual road. The difference isn't that medieval maps were wrong and ours are right, it's that they answered different questions. Future historians may scoff at our own maps with equal amusement. Those crisp satellite images we take for granted, they'll seem as quaint as vellum parchments when quantum cartography renders real-time 3D planetary scans. Our obsession with national borders may look as arbitrary as TO Map's tripartite divisions once colonialism's legacy is fully reckoned with. Already, indigenous mapping projects challenge Western grids, plotting land through watersheds and ancestral routes rather than latitudes. If medieval maps seem ignorant today, ours may one day appear equally myopic, trapped in the blind spots of our own era. Underneath this debate lies a philosophical grenade. What is a map even for? Is it a tool for control, as kings and tech giants insist? A canvas for cultural dreams, as the Hereford Mappa Mundi suggests? Or perhaps a mirror, reflecting not the world as it is, but as we fear or long for it to be? The dragons on the edges of medieval maps didn't vanish, they migrated to our horror films and conspiracy theories, still lurking where our knowledge runs out. Every map, then or now, is a confession. Here's what we value, here's what we ignore, and here be the monsters we're not ready to face. Medieval maps didn't just depict the world, they defined reality itself, stitching together earth and heaven into a single, sacred fabric. For the cartographers of the Middle Ages, a river wasn't merely water flowing downhill. It might trace the path of a saint's miracle or echo one of the 4 rivers of Eden. Mountains weren't just geological formations, they were the ramparts of divine order holding back chaos. This wasn't a world where the spiritual and physical existed separately. They were layers of the same truth, interwoven like threads in a tapestry. The Hereford Mappa Mundi shows this vividly. Christ presides over the entire map, his hands and feet marking the edges of creation, while below him, cities and seas jostle for space amid scenes from Scripture. Geography wasn't neutral ground, it was holy ground, every landmark charged with meaning. Fast forward to today, and our maps couldn't be more different. Satellite imagery, GPS coordinates, and algorithmic precision have stripped away the layers of myth, leaving behind a world measured in pixels and vectors. Google Maps doesn't care if a mountain was once thought to house a dragon. It'll give you its elevation in meters and the fastest route to its summit. This shift from sacred to scientific isn't just about technology, it's a revolution in how we see, where medieval maps framed the unknown as a realm of divine mystery. Our digital charts treat it as a problem to be solved, a blank space waiting for data. The dragons haven't disappeared, they've been downgraded to metadata. But have we lost something in this trade-off? Medieval maps were unapologetically human-flawed, subjective, and rich with stories. A modern topographic map can tell you the exact gradient of a hill, but it won't whisper that pilgrims once collapsed there in ecstasy, claiming to see visions. The precision of our tools has come at the cost of a deeper, more visceral connection to place. We navigate with our eyes glued to screens, following blue dots on grids, while medieval travelers moved through landscapes alive with symbolism. A forest wasn't just trees, it was where the green man lurked, where outlaws hid, where the boundary between village and wilderness blurred. Maps weren't just tools, they were companions, shaping how people felt about the world as much as how they moved through it. Yet the medieval approach is far from extinct. Contemporary artists and designers are rediscovering the power of maps as storytelling devices. Take artist Matthew Cusick's collages, where vintage maps become oceans in swirling, wave-like formations, geography transformed into emotion. Or the psychogeographic atlas projects that layer modern cities with medieval motifs, turning subway lines into pilgrim routes and skyscrapers into modern-day Towers of Babel. Even video games like Elden Ring or the Witcher series craft maps teeming with the same mix of precision and myth that defined the Hereford Mappa Mundi, where every village has a legend and every fog-covered region hints at danger. These creations aren't rejections of modern cartography, they're rebellions against its sterility, reclaiming the right to wonder. The tension between these two worldviews, the sacred and the scientific, isn't just academic. It's about how we choose to inhabit the world. Do we see land as a resource to be plotted and exploited, or as a narrative to be lived? Medieval maps offer a provocative answer. That precision without poetry is a kind of poverty. As we digitize every inch of the planet, their legacy challenges us to leave room for the unquantifiable, for the stories, spirits, and sheer stubborn mystery that no satellite can ever capture. The next time you zoom in on a map, ask yourself, what's not there and who gets to decide? Medieval maps have slithered out of history books and into the pulsing heart of pop culture, their inked beasts and cryptic borders now lurking in the pages of fantasy novels and glowing on high-definition screens. Take the opening credits of Game of Thrones, a masterclass in cartographic seduction. As the camera swoops over Westeros, the landscape unfurls like a living parchment, castles rising like wax seals and roads snaking like inked quill strokes. This isn't just a map, it's a character whispering of warring houses and icy terrors beyond the wall. The show's creators didn't just borrow the aesthetic of medieval maps, they weaponized their storytelling power. Every jagged coastline and shadowed forest echoes the Hereford Mappa Mundi's blend of geography and myth, where places aren't just locations but legends waiting to be unraveled. The Lord of the Rings takes this further, embedding maps so deeply in its DNA that Middle-earth feels excavated from some ancient archive. Tolkien, a scholar of Old English, deliberately mimicked the visual language of medieval cartography, the crabbed runes, the exaggerated mountain ranges, the deliberate blank spaces labeled, "Here be dragons," though the phrase itself never appears in historical maps. His maps aren't accessories, they're artifacts designed to feel like relics Bilbo might have tucked into his red book. Modern fantasy games like The Witcher 3 or Elden Ring follow suit, their maps littered with ruined towers and cursed swamps that could have been lifted straight from a monk's fever dream. The appeal is primal. These maps don't just guide players, they haunt them, turning every fog-covered corner into a promise of danger or wonder. What's fascinating is how modern creators balance historical homage with creative license. The Dungeons & Dragons world of Faerun mirrors medieval TO maps with its continent-spanning empires and vague edges, but it's also peppered with anachronisms like gunpowder and airships. Netflix's The Bastard Son and the Devil himself reimagines European folklore with maps that glow like alchemical manuscripts, their borders pulsing with hidden magic. Even indie tabletop games like Mosrata use chunky, woodcut-style icons to evoke the rough charm of a 15th-century portolan chart. The best of these works don't just copy medieval maps, they converse with them, answering their mysteries with new ones. This revival isn't nostalgia, it's recognition. In an age of GPS and satellite surveillance, we crave maps that leave room for the unknown. A medieval style map, with its sea serpents and phantom islands, taps into something deeper than navigation. It's an invitation to wander, to imagine what might lurk beyond the edges. When a video game lets you uncover a hidden temple by piecing together a torn vellum map, or a novels in papers hint at uncharted continents, they're channeling the same thrill that once sent sailors veering off Ptolemy's grids. The dragons have migrated from parchment to pixels, but their magic hasn't dimmed. If anything, they've grown fiercer, their shadows stretching across genres and platforms, proving that the human hunger for uncharted territory is as old as the first map and as endless as the worlds we've yet to dream. Deciphering a medieval map starts with unlearning everything you know about modern cartography. Forget accuracy to scale or GPS coordinates. These documents operate on a different logic entirely. Take wind faces, those puff-cheeked figures often swirling around the edges of nautical charts. To modern eyes, they look like whimsical decorations, but to a 14th century sailor, they were vital data. Each face represents one of the 12 classical winds, their breath directionally precise, Boreas blowing from the north, Zephyrus whispering from the west. These weren't just artistic flourishes, they were a survival tool, helping navigators predict storms and currents long before compasses became widespread. The same goes for zodiac symbols inked alongside calendar rounds. They weren't astrology but agricultural almanacs, marking when to plant or harvest based on celestial cycles. To read these maps, you must tune into their frequency, where art and utility blur. Symbols often hid in plain sight. A city drawn larger than its neighbors wasn't a cartographic error. It was a power statement, likely commissioned by a local ruler to inflate his domain's importance. Crosses clustered near rivers might signal pilgrimage routes, while a cluster of towers could indicate taxable trade hubs rather than literal architecture. Even color carried coded meaning: gold for holiness, red for danger, green for fertile lands. The Hereford Mappa Mundi's crocodile-infested Nile isn't zoological fact but moral allegory, warning of spiritual peril in exotic lands. Every ink stroke served dual purposes, guiding the body while schooling the soul. The biases run deeper than misplaced mountains. medieval maps were mirrors of their makers' worldviews, and spotting those distortions reveals who held the pen and the power. Notice how Jerusalem consistently anchors Christian maps, while Islamic counterparts like Al-Idrisi's Tabula Rogeriana center on the Mediterranean's trade networks. Coastlines might warp to accommodate a patron's political claims, or entire regions vanish if their people didn't fit the preferred narrative. Africa's interior, rich with thriving empires like Mali, often shrinks into a monster-filled void because European cartographers lacked or ignored first-hand accounts. Reading critically means asking whose story is being amplified, whose is being erased. What makes these maps timeless isn't their accuracy, but their audacity. They dared to weave faith, fear, and curiosity into a single document, refusing to separate the world as it was from the world as it was dreamed. When you unfurl one today, you're not just seeing geography, you're witnessing the birth of exploration, the agony of the unknown, and the raw human urge to make meaning from chaos. Those wind faces still have something to whisper, that every map then and now is a confession of what we value enough to preserve and what we're still afraid to face. Medieval maps do more than document geography. They expose the fragile, fiercely human act of making sense of the unknown. Those sea serpents curling at the edges of parchment weren't just decorative flourishes. They were admissions of vulnerability, graphic acknowledgments that beyond a certain point, knowledge dissolved into legend. Today, we might swap monsters for metaphors, labeling unfamiliar cultures as volatile or reducing complex histories to slick infographics, but the impulse remains the same, to fill voids with the shapes of our own anxieties and aspirations. The real magic of these maps lies in their honesty. They don't pretend to objectivity. Instead, they scream from every gilded border and distorted coastline. This is how we saw ourselves, and this is how we feared or longed for what lay beyond. Consider the parallels to our digital age. Algorithms now draw invisible borders around us, feeding personalized realities where Jerusalem isn't at the center of the world, we are. Social media maps our interests with the same selective bias as a medieval monk enlarging his patron's kingdom. The danger isn't just in being wrong, it's in forgetting that our vision, like the Hereford Mapar Mundi's, is inevitably filtered through layers of privilege, tradition, and unchecked assumptions. When a 14th century cartographer drew Africa as a land of headless men, he wasn't documenting fact, he was revealing the limits of his world's curiosity. What blind spots do our own maps, literal and metaphorical, betray? Yet there's hope in this legacy. Medieval maps also showcase creativity's power to transcend bias. The Catalan Atlas, woven from Jewish, Arab, and Christian knowledge, proved that collaboration could redraw the world more richly than dogma allowed. Today, indigenous mapping projects reclaim stolen landscapes by overlaying ancestral trails onto colonial grids, just as LGBTQ+ histories are resurrecting erased neighborhoods on urban maps. These acts aren't corrections, they're rebellions, proving that every map is a battleground of narratives waiting to be rewritten. So the next time you navigate by GPS or skim a news map, pause. Ask what's magnified and what's minimized. Question whose Jerusalem sits at the center and whose stories are banished to the edges. Medieval maps remind us that every worldview is provisional, a temporary sketch awaiting new discoveries, new voices. They challenge us to wield our own pens with humility, to leave room in the margins for wonders we can't yet imagine. Because the greatest lesson those old parchments teach isn't about the past, it's about the future and the vital act of mapping not just the world as it is, but as it could be. Medieval maps were never just about getting from one place to another. They were epic narratives inked onto parchment, where every coastline whispered a legend and every blank space hummed with possibility. From the dragons gnashing at the edges of the Hereford mappa Mundi to Jerusalem's gilded dominance at the center of TO maps, these documents didn't just chart geography, they wove entire worldviews into existence. They were sermons without pulpits, political manifestos disguised as topography, and mirrors reflecting the fears and fascinations of the societies that created them. The monsters weren't mistakes, they were metaphors. The distortions weren't errors, they were editorials. These maps asked not where we are, but who we are, and what we dare to believe about the universe beyond our horizons. Their legacy is everywhere if you know where to look. Video game landscapes still borrow their visual language, with fog-shrouded regions hinting at danger like medieval cartographers sketching sea serpents. Modern infographics echo their persuasive power, bending data into shapes that serve narratives, just as kings once twisted coastlines to glorify their realms. Even our digital maps, for all their algorithmic precision, can't resist the allure of storytelling. Why else do we still label places as uncharted territory or frame explorations as quests? The medieval urge to blend fact and fantasy hasn't vanished. It's evolved, pixelated but still potent. But perhaps their greatest gift is the humility they force upon us. However advanced our tools become, these ancient maps remind us that every representation of the world is filtered through human hands and human biases. The Hereford mappa Mundi's insistence on Jerusalem's centrality feels archaic now. But how different are we when our digital maps prioritize certain borders, certain histories, certain voices? The past isn't just a curiosity, it's a cautionary tale, urging us to question whose stories get centered and whose get relegated to the margins. So where do we go from here? The adventure isn't over. Libraries and museums guard these treasures like dragons hoarding gold. The British Library's digital collections let you zoom into the Catalan atlas's intricate details, while the Hereford Cathedral offers virtual tours of its namesake map. Books like the Hereford World Map or Cartographies of Time unpack their secrets further. And if you're feeling daring, try this. Sketch your own medieval map of your neighborhood, blending landmarks with local lore. What monsters lurk in the alleyways? What sacred sites anchor your mental geography? The exercise isn't just fun, it's a bridge across centuries, connecting your hand to the ones that once traced vellum with quills. The next time you unfold a map, whether on paper or screen, pause. Listen for the whispers of those medieval makers, their ink-stained fingers pointing not just to places, but to possibilities. Because the most enduring lesson of these ancient documents isn't about navigation, it's about imagination. They challenge us to see the world not just as it is, but as it could be. Now it's your turn. Dive into those digital archives, lose yourself in a museum's collection, or share your favorite map mysteries below. After all, the best maps don't end with edges, they begin with curiosity. Where will yours